So welcome everyone to today's webinar from Prefer, where the team and I are going to talk about areas of future research in patient preferences. This webinar is being recorded and it will be made public afterwards, but we will make sure that we remove questions and personal information before publication. Just a quick disclaimer that this study was funded by IMI, and the views and opinions in this presentation are of those of the individual presenters and not of other institutions or that of the funders. Here's the agenda today, along with the presenters. This group has been working on the future research chapter that goes into the recommendations that are being written by Prefer. I'm going to talk a little bit about Prefer background, just to kind of make sure everyone knows what the goals of Prefer were and where we are now, and then turn it over to individual presenters that you see here on the topics. When people are presenting, I'm asking them to introduce themselves briefly and their role on Prefer, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So just to give some background, preferences, what are they? Preferences help measure what matters, how much, and the relative weights between what's important to you. So in this example that you see here, if we were to ask you one at a time when considering a treatment, what's important, you might tell me everything is important. And of course, this is true. But what we try to do in a patient preference study is to elicit the relative importance of these things, that price may be important to you, but the effectiveness is perhaps going to be more important than the price, and so on. So we try to tease out what matters and how much, and get into some trade-offs of what you would trade between these different attributes of a treatment. There are a lot of questions around patient preference studies and how and when to best conduct them and which methods and so on. And so part of Prefer was to dig a little deeper through case studies and look at these questions. The project goals were to establish recommendations on how and when to include preferences on benefits and risks of medical products. So as part of the project, there were 3 different phases. The first one was a fairly detailed assessment of stakeholder needs. In order to figure out what's important to research, as part of Prefer, we needed to kind of get an understanding of what was needed. Once we did an appraisal of the methods and the stakeholder needs, we were able to conduct case studies, where the case studies were to answer some of the questions identified in the needs assessment. So now we're in step 3. We did get a slight extension. This was during the pandemic, but we're getting ready to wrap up the study or the project with recommendations. So that's where we are now. As part of Prefer, there were 11 prospective case studies, more than a dozen clinical research questions, a similar number of methodological questions, and we looked at a variety of different preference elicitation methods, educational tools, which you'll hear a little bit more about what these are, as well as some psychological constructs. And again, you're going to hear a little bit more about this. And these studies covered a wide number of populations in a number of countries. And we involved patient research partners, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that as well. So the case studies were set up to answer some of the pressing methodological and clinical questions that were identified. So Prefer recommendations are under finalization now, and there's going to be a webinar in April to talk more about that. But these recommendations lay the groundwork for how and when to conduct preference studies across the medical product lifecycle. Many thanks to people on Prefer. This was a large collaboration, and the development of the recommendations and all of the research work allowed us to understand what might be a future research need. And so these future research ideas presented here are based on a large mountain of work from Prefer, and also take into account that during the 6-year period, the external landscape and methodological work was also maturing. So that's the background on Prefer. I'm now going to turn it over to Jorien to talk about the future research regarding methods research. Jorien?
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. I'm Jorien Veldwijk. I'm an assistant professor at the University Medical Center of Utrecht and the Erasmus School of Health Policy and Management. And in Prefer, I'm the academic co-lead for the work package on the case studies. I've been included in several case studies, and I was involved in a task within Prefer in which we've compared all the methods that we've applied in those case studies. If you can go to the next slide, Rachel. So in line with the strategy that we formulated within Prefer in the beginning, most of the case studies that we've conducted used a discrete choice experiment to elicit preferences, but also one other preference elicitation method, and that could either be the probabilistic threshold technique, best worst scaling case 2, swing weighting, or best worst scaling case 1. And I will show you some high-level results here of the comparisons, because the details will be presented in a webinar on March 8th, focusing specifically on the methods used and the differences in outcomes that we got from the methods that were applied within the same case study. But what we see and what we saw across actually all of the case studies that compared two methods is that the ranking of attributes is highly comparable, especially for the most important attributes. You can also see that in the pictures here. It's the same attribute that is valued most important. However, if we then look at the weights, or for instance, the maximum acceptable risk that you can calculate if you get preference outcomes, there we see significant differences between discrete choice experiments and actually all of the other methods. So on the left, you see a picture from a diabetes study, and on the right, it's a picture from a lung cancer case study. And although the order of the attributes is the same, the range of the importance scores, it's much greater in the DCE than that it is in the other method to which it is compared in these both case studies. So if you go to the next slide, we can see that this exact same thing actually, because what we did is, besides those comparisons on a case study level, we also did a more high level comparison even, and that is doing a bootstrapping exercise to determine the robustness of the outcomes in each of the case studies. And we see the same thing here, is that we took the diabetes case study as an example on this slide, and what you can see in the column on the DCE is that cost was most important. If you look at the swing weighting column, we see the same thing, cost is most important, but the relative weight put on this attribute in the DCE is much greater than that it is in the swing weighting experiment. And we also see that for glucose information, it's the least important attribute in the DCE. So the spread of those values is much greater in the DCE than it is in the swing weighting experiment. And we see a similar picture for all of the other case studies for which we did this bootstrapping exercise. Thank you. So what we also did is a multi-criteria decision analysis to determine the importance of particular characteristics of methods according to the decision makers along the medical product lifecycle, and that were industry representatives, but also regulators and HTA or reimbursement representatives. And on the left side of this slide, you see the methods, criteria, or characteristics that were valued as most important by these decision makers. And if you then, so we calculated a weight for each of the characteristics, also for these most important ones, but of course also for the ones that were less important. And then For each of the methods applied in Prefer, we know if these methods comply with each of the characteristics. So we could calculate sort of a score or a total value for each of the methods across all of the decision points within the medical product lifecycle. And what we can see in the picture on the right is that the threshold technique and the swing weighting score quite high, and actually higher than the other methods for all of the decision points across the medical product lifecycle, followed by the DCE and then less worse scaling. If you can click next. So in the chapter on future studies, we wrote several recommendations. Well, first of all, to focus also on the use of the threshold technique, best-worst scaling, and swing weighting, as well as even other preference elicitation methods that weren't conducted within any of the case studies in Prefer, to gain expertise on these methods, to test the feasibility of these methods, and also to develop evidence-based guidelines for these methods, because that will help to conduct them correctly. And that might also be the reason, the fact that there aren't any evidence-based guidelines might also be the reason that these methods are used less often than the discrete choice experiment, for which these documents do exist. We also, if you can go back. We also advise to compare different preference elicitation methods, both the comparisons that we already did in Prefer, because I mean, although we did a lot of case studies, sometimes we only compared a method once in one of the case studies, so we would like to build more expertise on those comparisons, but also comparisons that weren't done in Prefer. We want to determine if and to what extent internal validity or data quality measures can and should be incorporated in preference studies. And of course, the measurement of the external validity should be explored to greater extent. And then on the next slide, we also had a task on transferability of preferences. And that is to determine whether the findings or results obtained for one situation in one specific context could also be applied to another situation in a different context. And in Prefer, we focused on other countries or other disease areas. And there we identified 3 categories of transferability factors. So first of all, those are methodological characteristics of a study. So the attributes and levels, for instance, that were selected. Population characteristics. So do the demographics of populations differ a lot, and also healthcare context. So the affordability or the standard of care for certain diseases might be different or comparable. Based on that, we've developed a checklist for transferability of preference studies. And we've applied it in all of the case studies. And also for this topic, we have some areas of future research identified. And first of all, we advise to study the usability of this transferability checklist that was developed within Prefer, and to see in which situations transferability might be appropriate, or in which decision context it might be useful actually to transfer preferences. And also which elements of preference studies actually affect transferability. Although we've specified those 3 areas, there might be more actually. And also I think, or we think that it's important to investigate the utility and the necessity of doing new or de novo preference studies versus actually do a quantitative meta-analysis based on previously published preference studies. And if we would want to move to such a meta-analysis, then it's important to make an assessment on the statistical methods that we need to use or need to apply to actually conduct such a meta-analysis. And then I would like to hand over to Marie.
Thanks, Jorien. Hi, everyone. I'm Marie Falahee. I'm a lecturer in behavioural rheumatology at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And I've been heavily involved in the core case study for Prefer on preventive treatments for rheumatoid arthritis. Next slide, please. So right from the outset of Prefer, the importance of involving stakeholders in the design, conduct, and dissemination of preference study has been recognised. And so involving patients in preference studies, for example, can enhance the relevance and make sure that a study is ethically designed, and also that it's fit for purpose from the user or participant perspective. And involving other stakeholders involved in decision-making throughout the medical product lifecycle can also, of course, ensure that the study is designed in a way to produce robust information to support decision-making. So in Prefer, there were a number of case studies, all of which, well, most of which involved patients in their design and conduct, and in some cases also in feeding back the results of the case study to participants and to the public. So, for example, the rheumatoid arthritis core case study involved a panel of 8 patient partners representing the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden, who were involved in every stage of the study, even from the earliest stages of the grant funding application for Prefer, through to developing a lay summary more recently of our survey findings and presenting our findings with us. And other stakeholders were also involved in some of our case studies. A really nice example of that is the Novartis study on preferences for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, and that study was the first to obtain scientific advice from NICE in the UK on the design of their study, particularly in relation to the selection of appropriate outcomes to include. And also in Prefer, we held a number of workshops with various stakeholders to discuss all of our case studies and their findings, and to learn more about the requirements of stakeholders in relation to patient preference studies in order that they're useful for decision making. And a key message from those workshops and those meetings really was that early involvement of stakeholders in a study is really crucial. So although we haven't really in Prefer set out to formally assess stakeholder involvement, I think in all instances we have felt there has been consensus that stakeholder involvement is highly valued, and the Prefer recommendations in Chapter 4 have set out guidance on how stakeholders can be usefully involved in every aspect of patient preference studies. But just reflecting on some areas that we haven't explored in Prefer that could be relevant for future research. So we have noted in our recommendations that training materials or that stakeholders might have and researchers might have specific training needs that could usefully be addressed to support their involvement in preference studies. And in Prefer, we haven't undertaken development and evaluation of specific training materials for that purpose, but that could be an important avenue to pursue. We've worked with specifically with our patient partners to develop lay summaries to share the findings of our patient preference studies, but there is scope to extend on that, to co-develop some really innovative digital platforms to assist in effective communication and dissemination of preference work and increase the impact of preference studies. And also there are some reporting standards for patient involvement, specifically in research in general, but there are none that relate specifically to patient preference studies, and also that address the inclusion or the involvement of other stakeholders. So there is also scope for an extension of existing checklists and standards for reporting of involvement in preference studies. So next slide, please. I'm not going to introduce myself again. I'm just going to keep talking. So I've also been involved in the parts of Chapter 8 that address measures of psychological constructs and when they're useful in preference studies. So one of a key kind of secondary objective of PREFER, as well as comparing different methods, was to understand whether measures of psychological or cognitive constructs can explain heterogeneity in patient preferences. So in PREFER, in the early stages of PREFER, a lot of work was undertaken to assess which measures could be useful, could explain preferences in this context, and also the factors that need to be considered when selecting measurement tools to incorporate into a patient preference survey. Next slide, please. So in PREFER, this was achieved with a systematic literature review and also a consensus-seeking exercise and the development of a checklist for the appraisal of psychological constructs. So there was consensus around a number of constructs that could be useful, both on the basis of existing literature and on expert consensus. And these were called Class 1 constructs and are listed here and include health literacy, health numeracy, illness perceptions, and so on. And then there were a number of other constructs for which there was good but not complete agreement about their role in patient preferences, such as measures of autonomy, preference, and decision making, and so on. So chapter 7 of the PREFER recommendation provides guidance on which methods to consider and some of the practical considerations also to take into account, such as the measure validity and reliability, and also the burden for participants completing a preference survey. So in PREFER, there were, as we've seen, a number of case studies, and each of them considered at least one or more psychological constructs in terms of their role of explaining preferences. And of the Class 1 constructs, health literacy and numeracy were included in 8 case studies across the PREFER portfolio. And then some other measures such as health locus of control, illness perceptions were included in other studies as well. So in terms of the evidence base, which is really in its infancy here, I think PREFER has provided some good agreement that health literacy and numeracy have had a role in explaining preference heterogeneity in the results of our case studies. But there's a lot of work still to be done here. So for all of the other, particularly the Class 1 constructs, but also the Class 2 constructs that have yet to be evaluated in a number of studies. So all of those constructs need to be evaluated across samples and populations, also across disease areas, treatment contexts, and also across different preference elicitation methodologies. And we also haven't included in PREFER assessment of the impact of inclusion of psychological measures on survey length, or when the appropriate position of a measure within a survey is, and how these kinds of considerations impact on the resulting preferences. Next slide, please. And so with that, I'll pass on to Serena to talk about educational tools.
Thank you very much, Marie. So I am Serena Oliveri, and senior researcher at the European Institute of Oncology in Milan. And I am academic lead for the lung cancer case study within PREFER. I've been involved to address the issue of future research in the application of educational material to preference studies. Next slide, please. Okay, so the application of educational material to preference studies is a very novel approach. and to increase the understanding of patients in preference studies, many guidelines, FDA and HTA guidelines, recommend that surveys will start with an educational section. These can ensure that patients can express their preference in a well-informed manner. And it can also maximize the validity of patient preference studies and data. In particular, the educational tools and the educational material can help to increase the understanding of the content, the context of the study, the disease, the attributes and attributes levels, and choice tasks, and can also minimize the error due to misunderstanding or unobserved heterogeneous interpretation of patients. Digital material in particular can also offer the ability to maximize the level of engagement and motivation of respondents. And in the context of preference studies, they can also simulate real choice situations, and can also assist the respondents in their education and also in their preference constructions. Next slide, please. Okay. So even if, consider that the current issue is that even if the application of the educational material, the educational tools should be evidence-based, it should be also scientifically and clinically validated. There are no guidelines, regulatory guidelines about how to apply, to develop, about the features that are needed for the preference studies. So within Prefer, we tried to apply an evidence-based approach and framework to develop the educational materials and educational tools within our case studies. And in particular, we followed 3 steps: the identification of the educational needs of patients, the selection and adaptation of the educational features to the specific populations and to the specific preference studies. And we try to choose the appropriate content formats. Next slide, please. To better describe these steps, I would like to use the examples from 2 of our case studies. For the identification of the educational needs, for example, in both rheumatoid arthritis and lung cancer studies, we have conducted interviews with the patients and with medical professionals in order to collect their feedback about what it was really needed as contents inside the educational tools. And we observed that these high experienced populations, we can define this population of patients as high experienced because they both had high experience with the disease and with the treatment options. We identified that their needs were moderate, and we decided to focus more on the attributes and attributes level. And that was the same for the selection of the features. We just needed moderate levels of realism and interactivity. About the choice of the appropriate content formats, we decided to use a friendly and simple interface with text accompanied by icons and voiceover, all simple formats that could speed up the learning process and ensure that the patients could have a coherent and overall overview of the attributes and their levels, and also to reply not only based on their previous experiences. Next slide, please. So the most of the patients gave a positive feedback about the educational material in Prefer. and they overall were satisfied with them. They found them useful. But what was really missing in our studies was an evaluation of comprehension, an objective evaluation of comprehension through comprehension tests that would have enabled a more objective evaluation of patients' understanding of the materials. Next slide, please. So the suggestion for future research areas in this field are, first of all, to achieve a consensus about how to define and to evaluate comprehension of educational material, to look into additional characteristics of patients, such as, for example, health literacy of patients, in order to better customize and tailor educational material on their needs. Assess respondents' level of experience and psycho-emotional sensitivity toward the topic addressed by the patient preference study. And then to identify the right balance between the educational tools features and the educational burden for the respondents. Thank you very much. I leave the speech to my colleague, Cecilia.
Thank you, Serena. So on my new section, and I'll just try to be brief on each of the new as we have labeled new topics or ranking for further research, just to allow time for the Q&A at the end, because I have seen coming so very interesting questions in the chat. So what we have labeled as new topics refers those research questions that either since the beginning or at the moment were outside the scope of preferred research. So either because at that time they were not under the scope, or maybe not as relevant as the questions that we decided to focus on, or moreover, after all these 6 years have become more relevant as they used to be, but certainly important. So I will list them one by one in the next slides. So one of them is individual preferences and shared decision-making within healthcare settings. So definitely there's a lot of research behind the methods of how to elicit patient preferences and how to make them more objective and with the least bias that we can have, how this could help us maybe in decision-making with healthcare providers. And make it more patient-centric as an objective tool to assess what patients wanted to say in that setting, not only medications. Can we create attribute libraries? So there are certainly some disease areas or symptoms that keep on coming more often in the patient preferences world, and there is a wide range of how the same outcome or same benefit or same risk has been framed or labeled. Maybe there could be a way to better harmonize this and then help generalizability of results or transferability of results, or even just the understanding of what we're saying on each of the patient preference studies. Can this be possible? Can we map what clinical outcome assessments, and this includes PRO, but other clinical outcome assessments as well, are telling to us? This is certainly a field with so much more history in research and development, and these are usually outcomes that are either framed already in a way that can be understood by patients, or that have certain ways of ranking them or assess them that can inform the way that we translate them into a patient preference method. But there is definitely a need to research how this can be translated, or how this can be incorporated or mapped into a patient preference study. So this is another area of opportunity that could support, I think, both of the outcomes, so the patient preference studies from the COAs, but as well vice versa. What the patient preference studies tell us, what of these is revealed later on in the post-marketing settings. So one of the main opportunities of doing patient preference studies is the think for the future and what will happen, to how much of it is really revealed afterwards. This is something as well that can be improved if we do further research with a more systematic structure that can come until post-marketing settings. And finally, we know there is usually a little bit of uncertainty or more uncertainty in some disease areas or compounds than others around both the benefits and the risks. And we are aware of how important it is to explain this uncertainty or translate this uncertainty to the patients. So it has been promoted when labeling a product, but it has also been promoted, or we are aware how this could also impact on the way that we describe benefits and risks when doing a patient preference study. What would be the best way to do it without going too far or confusing the patient or losing the meaning of those trade-offs that we want to assess as well. So these were just a few additional ones from that big bunch of questions that Rachael showed at the end. And we are aware that within these 6 years, the patient preferences, knowledge, awareness had moved like really, really significantly. So not within Prefer only, but also outside. And the question is, well, now in this new time point, what are the key priority questions to keep moving forward in this research to improve the delivery of patient preference studies? And this is one of the plans for Prefer as well. And so to rank the topic of this research agenda, including the non-within Prefer scope. And to make it more important, we want to include not only Prefer consortium members, but also externally patient preference researchers, patient preference experts. And this hopefully will be a material for public access that will encourage further research into patient preferences development and delivery.